Good morning. So today we're going to get into mesh networks. You can see from this list that we've got a number of different jobs to do. I want you to know right now that the most comprehensive version of what each of these will be in the video. And this list is the actual list. This list will be changed a little bit as I go through. I've refined it now a couple of semesters, so I think I've got it down to where I want it to be, and I modified it a little bit more this semester, and I may make some adjustments as we go through. This should take us 2 weeks with 4 sessions, so that's going to be, instead of 1 session per week, I'm going to have to do 2 per week until I get through this whole list, or whatever is sooner. So hopefully I can get it done in 2 sessions, but we'll see how it goes. Another thing to pay attention to is that there's a very small section that I started to write out up here about mesh networks. It's not very well written out yet, but in here is a section about one of our earlier videos that has a step-by-step that we'll need. So I'll point at that when we need it. For the most part, you just keep your eyes on the mesh at the animations due at the end of the semester section, mesh networks, and it's this list is the list of animations we're making. So let's get started with the first one. All right, let's get started. So if you're not already in the shared notes, please get down to this section of the animations due at the end of the semester, number 10, mesh networks. I'm not sure why it's number 10. My numbering is all wrong. It should really be number 4 out of all of our assignments. Okay, so first things first, we are going to look at the sandbox. First introduce its parts, and then superficially explore the mesh networks and its animated effects. This should take a little bit of time, very short amount of time. I don't intend to go very deep into this. Then we'll get into our projects. So let's get set up to use mesh. Okay, so we're looking at our workspace, our animation 2 workspace. We've already made this one. We're in the animation menu set. Let's minimize the graph editor. Let's go to the mesh menu and pull out the mesh editor. You absolutely have to have this window. I like to dock it between the outliner and the channel box, and I also like to have my attribute editor out because I need this frequently, and I'm going to dock that right there so that it's tabbed with the channel box and the content browser. And that should set us up, and I also have my timeline across the top like I've been doing in the past. Alright, so let's just glance at what's in here. First and foremost, look at the mesh network option box. Notice I can create a mesh network here with the option box. I can also create a mesh network here but without the option box. So whatever I set in the option box here are going to be the settings when I click the create button over here. So the common settings I want you to have, if I reset this, the common settings I want you to have would be mesh under geometry type, and I want you to have a single distribution type, so basically a single object created initially. I don't need to have any of these others, and I'll show you how to get those, how to change those later on as we use it. Alright, so then choose to apply. Now the next time we run the mesh network, we will have we'll have those settings each time we run a new and create a new mesh network. And if we need to change it, we just go up here to the option box. While we're up here, notice that we have utilities, which are a number of things. We're not going to look at all of these pieces, but we have things like caching, creating a deformer, creating switching between geometry types, between mesh and instancer, baking instancers. We have things like shell dynamics, which we will definitely be looking at in one of our lessons. Okay, so another thing to pay attention to is that if I disable DAG objects, what I have is a list of all the things that are in the scene. We know this from some of our other course content. So this just gives me visibility to everything that's there. And one of the things that we see, or many things that we see, are all of the mesh related objects. So if I if I enable DAG objects only, we're limited to seeing only the the repro mesh, and we see the mesh node. This object right here is called the waiter, W-A-I-T-E-R. So this is the waiter, and we can see that name right here. And we see how many points are in the waiter in this number right here. Now all of these fancy icons, I'm actually going to say I don't use these per se. I use this plus button right here, and notice it's the same list. It's the same name. So you're going to see me using this list, and you're going to see in other videos by other artists on YouTube, particularly Ian Waters, who is my first teacher on MASH, and he's one of the creators of MASH. He uses this GUI, this GUI over here, but I like to use this list right here. All right, so another thing to pay attention to is, again, if I turn off DAG objects, I can delete the MASH network simply by deleting the waiter, but that does leave behind a ghost, weirdly enough. There's a ghost of that waiter, so it looks like it's not deleted, but if you close the editor, reopen the editor, it is actually deleted. So there's a little bug there, and I wanted to point that out to you. So let's turn the DAG objects back on. All right, so that just shows you like where things are in the components across the interface. If there's something more about that, then I'll expand on that at a later time. All right, next thing, let's look at some basics. So let's create, holding the spacebar, create a polygon cube, and with this cube selected, go to create mesh network, and what we get is a cube that's hidden, and then a mesh repro mesh, which is basically just the exact same duplicate of that cube. And then we have a waiter, and then that waiter has a child to it, that's the distribution node. And the distribution node gives me how many points there are. So technically I have 10 cubes stacked over on top of each other. So if I increase the distribution distance, we can see that I actually have 10 cubes over this distance. And by the way, any of these things are animatable effects. So if you can right click on any of these parameters, it is an animatable channel, including how many are there. So we can even animate the growth of that. We're going to do a demonstration of that one in a later assignment. Some things to pay attention to. So first of all, let's just change this to, say, grid. And when we change it to grid, we have a distance on the grid, and then we have the number of objects in that grid. So our cube, if we recall, if we click the hidden cube and go to polycube, we see our cube is 1 by 1 by 1. And this is going to be a very fast and efficient object, and multiplying and moving on a value, multiplying on one and adding on one and subtracting and dividing on one is going to be very, very easy for us to figure out the mathematics on it. So if I want to distribute this 10 by 10 on the X and Z axis, then I can add 10 and 10 here and get a clean distribution. Although there's still a slight gap between them, so you can add 11 and 11 to close that gap. And that gives us a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 cubes across a distance of 10 in each direction. If I look at this, we are looking at a total of 10 units across. So this is a 5 by 5 block, 5 by 5. And so this is a 10, 10 with an extra 1 and an extra 1 to close that gap. Okay, now if we did something like random, which is going to be one of our assignments, we can randomly position these objects. And if we look at the random settings, we can edit their random positions. Again, these are all animatable effects. We could get in there and keyframe these manually, editing the position of these cubes. So if we say 0, 0, 0, we're saying don't move them. You could turn on the wireframe to see them. Rotation, we have random rotations. And again, animatable. And what our first assignment is going to be, the number 1, grid of objects, random positions, fall off object, add mode effect. We're going to look at that first. That's coming straight out of one of Ian Waters' videos, and I'm just translating it for you. And then we're going to branch off of what he's taught into other content. All right, so let's set this back to 0, 0, 0. And then we now have a random node, and we also have an animated effect that's really easy to use. It's called signal. And if we hit play on the timeline with the signal node, we can see that they are all animated and they're using a signal type of 4D noise. We can use trigonometry, sinusoidal waves. We can set this range to 1000 to see it play out. We can change the amplitude, which is basically changing its Y or X or Z position. Whether they rotate as well, and that is a change in their rotation, so we can get this interesting random movement. And we can even manipulate their scale, like how much they do or do not scale, which is interesting. And I can change their frequency, which should be in the somewhere in here. Yeah, that's the frequency, the time. We can get some pretty interesting effects just out of the signal noise. And then we can look at the curl noise. And here we have the number of octaves. And we can have quite a bit of fun playing with that. And then I'll explore strength and fall off more in our follow-up assignments. So we'll skip that for the moment. And then we have other possibilities like this fractional Brownian motion. Which has a tendency to look and feel a little bit like a jelly. It's very interesting. Okay, so that's one possibility. Then we can disable signal and even disable random and keep them there as we play and explore. Then let's get another one. Let's look at dynamics. That's another one we're going to play with. Dynamics automatically gets a colliding object at -20. And we have an automatic collision shape, and if we simply hit play, all the objects will fall to the ground and disperse. So that's going to be a big part of our work as well. So we have, again, just superficially dynamics right off the top. Okay, let's stop looking at that one and disable it. We'll look at that a lot more closely later on. And we have things like flight and explode, which have a number of cool things in them. This would be great for creating schools of fish, flocks of birds, insect swarms. Okay, close that one. And curve. So if I had a curve in the scene, so if I create a curve, a CV curve, or maybe just a pencil curve, let's just do a pencil curve, and draw a quick curve, I can animate my cube along that curve. And let's rewind. And I want to have an animation speed and the input curves, right. So middle click, drag and drop curve 1 into the input curves, and you can see this entire network goes along for the ride while somehow keeping shape. Now this is very strange, but I wanted you to see that I can immediately assign an object to it. So if I go back to my distribution node and I change that to linear, and then I set the distribution distance to 0 and even the number of points to 1, and I go to my curve over here, I can get that object to travel along the path. So no different than path animation that we did earlier. It's path animation done in the Mesh editor. That's as far as I'm going to take that. Okay, now I want to get into our first assignment. Okay, first one. Mesh number 1. This is the fall off objects category. Grid of objects, random positions, fall off object, add mode effect. Now this is based on Ian Waters' video here from from a while ago, several years ago, and you're welcome to watch that and go through that and see how I translate it. But if you try to do exactly what he's doing without a little help, I think you're going to get stuck. So I'm going to translate what he's doing into our video. So let's get started. First, let's create a grid, and that grid is, I'm sorry, wow, I can't believe I said grid. That's from another software. Polyplane. Let's make a polygon plane. And first and foremost, let's set that polygon plane to be very, very simple so that we get fast mesh networks. Let's set this to 1 by 1 by 1 by 1. So it's a single 4-point polygon. Okay, I'll hide my my world grid. That's the grid in Maya. All right, so with the polyplane selected, we'll go to create mesh network. Double click the distribution node, and let's change the distribution type to grid. There's the grid, there's the word. I guess that's why I had it in my mind. And then let's change this to about 50 on X and about, let's do 30 on Z. And then again, 50 on X and 30 on Z. So we've got this broad plane of multiple pieces. And I can change the background color so that we can see through. You're welcome to turn the wireframe on if you want to. That does make things render a little longer if your video card can't handle that. So we can turn off the wireframe for you. All right, first thing we want to do, and again, looking at my list, I want a grid of objects. Got it. Now I want random positions. Okay, let's do random positions. So that's going to be the plus sign here and random. And so that randomizes the whole thing. Now I want to create a fall off object to control that. So I need a fall off object with an add mode effect. So let's look at the fall off object first. So the fall off object, if we scroll down on the attribute editor and look for fall off object, we can right click and choose create, double click, and we can see the fall off shape is a sphere, and we can see a sphere that's been added to the scene. You can select that sphere and move it around and see its effect, which reveals, like a mask, it reveals the random effect. We can change the shape of the fall off object, and we can rotate it, although that will have little impact on a flat plane. And of course, obviously you just saw we can translate it. Now what I want to do is play with this add feature. So as I move it through, it adds the effect, keeping the objects where they are. So it's kind of like a revealing, like you're scratching off the black on a piece of paper to reveal the colors underneath. One of those scratch off drawing sketchbooks type thing. And if I hit rewind or hit play or just move this away and hit rewind and hit play, it should snap them back, although it's not happening. That's okay. Let's change this to add mode fade and increase that to about 0.021, somewhere in there. Just a very little amount of it. So now when I scrub or move around the fall off object, you can see that it returns back to its position. Very, very cool. Kind of acts like a watery particle type effect. And again, I can change the shape, and we can change how quickly it returns. So if we add mode fade a lot, it returns very, very, very fast. Returns back to shape. If we add mode fade just a little bit, it has a tailing off effect. And then we just kind of keep moving the cursor around as we're dragging it around, and it tails off, dragging behind. And then maybe a little bit more where I had it, 0.2, 0.02, 0.03. That seemed to have a nice effect. Okay, and that's basically, that is mesh number 1 right there. Now what we're going to do is explore mesh number 1 a little bit more. So we can change the shape to a cube, and the cube can well, it's a cube. I mean, what else is there to say about it? Then we can have a NURBS curve. All right, so a NURBS curve. So we need a curve. So again, create a curve, and let's get a curve, say from the pencil tool, and just draw a curve through. Now, if I go back to my random shape, and expand additional options and expand connections, I have a shape in connection right here. Middle click, drag and drop the curve into that shape in connection, and you can see now that the fall off is affected by that curve. And if I say animate or change the shape of the radius, you see I can grow, shrink, or change the effect distance as a distance from that curve. All right, and then of course I can animate the position of the curve and see it have an effect on the object, which has a nice wiping or swiping effect, maybe a transition effect. As well as its rotation, which is pretty cool. Okay, and then let's take that a little bit further. Again, go to the fall off node, and we have particles. We'll look at that example in another place, and we also have mesh. So let's look at mesh. So I can define a new mesh, and we'll say something like polytorus, and increase the size of the polytorus, something like that. And we can use the polytorus in that input. Just replace it, and so now we have a polygon torus as the effect. And again, its scale, its position of points, all that has an impact. Very, very cool. Love it. All right, let's go back to the random, right click and choose to break the connection. So that's how we can break the connection. And let's remove the curve, remove the torus. So now we're just back to the random positions. Let's briefly look at the strength of it. So here's where I can animate the strength of it, like make it 100% random to back to where it was. Or I can change the randomness of the strength. So not all of them are all affected equally. So then again, I can sort of break it apart a little bit. And then something like strength step literally walks through each item at an index of 0 to however many there are in the waiter. So there are 1,500 objects in the waiter. So it's walking through from 0 to 1,499 for a total of 1,500 as it walks through. I can also use a strength map, which can be a texture like a 2D texture on a ramp, and I can change the positions on the ramp, and we can even switch this to a U ramp, switching to the other direction. And we played with these a little bit. I think it was this class, maybe it was somewhere else, but yeah, we played with these a little bit, fading in and fading out on a position. And we can also add noise to that ramp, further creating texture in the fall off. All right, so we'll go back to that and right click strength map and choose to break that connection. And then finally we have something as called a map helper. I don't intend to look at that right now, but we can make another texture as a helper to drive what's happening on this object. All right, so now let's remove the random, let's add the color node and move into our mesh number 1A. So mesh 1A is, again, a re-explaining what Ian Waters does in his very first fall-off video on mesh networks. And this is raining down the particles. So there's a very specific way this is set up, and I need you to pay attention to this order right here. For the change color by mesh network, raining particles from Ian Waters, the order of the setup while watching his video. So this is the order. So in the mesh editor node, we're going to create the color node, and it should be above the transform node if we're looking at his video. I'm going to do what he did, but it has to be above his transform node. The transform transform the Reaper mesh before adding particle collisions, and particle collisions come before adding the fall off object. So I just demonstrated the fall off object to you, but now we want to look into, now we want to use that, but I have to build up these other things in order, and then finally we get to the fall off control. All right, so here's how it goes. So let's let's just remove that. Right click, remove this. Right click and choose remove. Okay. So let's start with a transform node. A transform node is simple. It allows you to manipulate the object. So if we right click underneath controller null and choose create, we can get this new object that allows us to manipulate the entire network and move it around. So in this case, I want to rotate it so that I can have objects hit it as we go. Then I'm going to add the color node plus color node, and then the color node, change the color to that bright blue. And then looking at our list, what do we do next? In the mesh editor, color node should be above transform node. Yes, it's above the transform node. Next, the repro mesh before adding the particle collisions. I did transform it already. That's the rotation. That's done. Now I want to add an emitter. So we're going to go to the effects menu set, end particles, and choose create emitter. Go to the option box. I'm going to reset my option box, change the emitter type to volume, and really that's about it really. And I'm going to hit apply. And then while I have the emitter selected, I'm going to move it above my object and I'm going to make it bigger, like so, and rewind and hit play. And I'm going to make sure I have 1000 frames. And notice it's just raining down particles. Okay, now that I have that, it says here, I wrote, the particle collisions come before the fall off object. So again, if you're watching Ian Waters and you're like, hey, it didn't work, that's because the particle collisions needs to happen before. I'm not sure what's different about his version of Maya and our version of Maya, but I figured out that the collisions has to come before. So what we're going to do is set the repro mesh, because mesh creates a single mesh, that mesh can become a collision object, just like what we did with bullet physics. So if we go here to is it right here? Where is it? It's underneath, yeah, it's actually underneath cloth, weirdly, but it's underneath cloth and it's called create a passive collider. So we're going to set this mesh to be a passive collider, meaning now the particles will see that mesh hit it. And you can see now the particles are glancing off of it like rain hitting the roof and sliding into the gutter. Before we go any further with this, go to the emitter, and underneath the emitter we have a nucleus, and then the nucleus we have a ground plane. So we can do an implied ground plane. Let's use that plane and set the plane origin to something like -5, so pushing it below. So if we rewind and hit play, now we can capture all those particles. They won't fall forever and ever and ever. And we can lower it a little bit more, maybe -8. And you can see that ground plane dropping down. Okay, so now that just captures the particles as they are being emitted. Now, another thing is that you might want to kill the particle over a certain period of time. Now, if I could just remember where I put that, there's a way to disable how long this particular particle lives, and I believe it's in the emitter, and or maybe it's the particle shape. Yeah, there it is, particle shape. Lifespan, the default lifespan is to live forever. What we can do is set a let's see here, a lifespan of and this is in, I believe this is in seconds, so we could say a lifespan of 2 seconds. Let's see how far it goes. Yeah, so you can see it dies off in 2 seconds. So let's set that to 5 seconds. Rewind and keep playing. So it'll collide, slide off, and then the, yeah, that's good. So now the particle will die off and we won't collect too many particles. So you can either continue to accumulate particles or you can kill them off. Ian Waters doesn't go through this little bit. I wanted you to see this tiny little bit. And I'm going to come back to the particle collisions in a little while. Let's continue what Ian Waters was doing. So now we want to see the fall off effect of this. What that means is that we can go to the color node, fall off, right click, choose create, double click that fall off object and change the shape to particles, and then go to connections, the end particle 1, middle click, drag and drop that into the shape in, and notice we now have the polygons lighting up. Just very cool. I have to say Ian Waters is a very clever guy. I really like this animated effect. And you can see that they tend to rain downward a little bit because each particle is hitting and it lands there. Now what we're going to do is change this to add, and then we're going to turn on, stop, rewind, we're going to turn on add mode fade to something like 0.021 or a little higher, 0.03. And now we get these raining like streaks down the side. And this is accomplishing what Ian Waters did in the video, and so now we have the right structure. Okay, let's just take this one step further and say, instead of having these little white dots, these invisible particles, which is cool, what if we wanted to see something on that particle? We want to take it a little bit further and see something there. Well, if we create a polygon primitive cube, or maybe just a sphere, it kind of doesn't matter to me. Let's stick with spheres, I guess, because they're simple. And in this sphere, go to the Polysphere tab and make it really, really simple, like 6 by 6. And make it small, like 0.25, something like that, really small. Now, with that sphere selected, I'm going to go to my N Particles Instancer option box and really change nothing. And what it's going to do is it's going to instantiate the sphere to the particle shape, and it's going to change its world position, and we can even change its rotation based on its age, and its rotation based on position and its direction or so forth, maybe based on velocity. We can play with this and then hit apply. And now we have these little spheres kicking around, falling down, raining down onto the object. And if we went back to that original sphere, do you remember back from our bullet physics lesson, we can, with that original sphere, even apply a new material, which is the shader, which is the AI standard surface, which is underneath the color channel, the checker icon, the 2D texture, the ramp. Once again, there's where we looked at the ramp. I was trying to remember where it was. We changed this to none, and then we added a couple of keys where we could change the colors. And if we go to this cursor, this viewport, and hit 6, we can see that color. And let's just add a couple of colors to this, and then we can change the repetition of that to maybe 4 by 4, and then change the ramp to a U ramp, and now we have these little textured objects raining down and rolling along. And there we can further analyze if they're truly rotating, and I can see that they're not quite rotating, but that would be another day and another dollar. But this is pretty cool. I think I've kind of opened this up for you a little bit more than where Ian Waters intended. However, Ian Waters' intention was to just show off the fall off objects, and that is the intention of this lesson. I just wanted to expand on it a little bit because we're going to come back to this a little bit later on when we have dynamics and we're raining down an object onto another object, and the raining down of that object is activating another object's dynamics, which is quite a bit of fun. All right, so that's number 2. Number 2. Or not number 2. 1A. Okay. Now, number 2. The NAB cube transition tutorial. Now, this is specifically this tutorial on YouTube from Ian Waters, and we can take a little bit of time to look at that. You go ahead and do that, and then I'll come back and continue my lesson. Right, and that effect is going to be here. I timestamped it for you. I put it in the shared notes. And what we're looking for is this transition-like effect. Not all that fancy stuff. It's really just the beginning. And he's going to demonstrate it right about in here, where he comes across right about here is the actual animated effect, and that's it right there, how it rotates and changes and slides around in a nice waveform. So we're actually going to be creating that part of this demonstration. All right, so let's get ourselves set up. First, create a polygon cube and set its height to 0.25. Right click and choose face. Click that top face. Choose edit mesh, poke, lift that point, and then just move that point to the side a little bit, so make it a little bit sharp. And then with this whole thing selected, again, go to mesh display, harden edges. That will sharpen it up. Then I want you to right click on it and choose assign new material, same stuff, AI standard surface, and choose a color. I'll go with a green, maybe a little desaturated, maybe not desaturated, nice and bright. Okay, and then choose face again, hold tab and choose these top 4 polygons. Right click again, choose add new material, go to the shader, AI standard surface, and again pick a color, and we'll choose something in the reds. So basically a change in color when it flips. And then if you want to make yours look a little bit like Ian Waters, it's kind of like this. You duplicate that cube, rotate E for rotation, hold down J, and then rotate it a couple of times so that you have your 2 little spikes in there. And then you can take those 2 objects and group them, Control G, and you can rename that the cube or the object or whatever it is, the tile that we're flipping. And all of this is done at the origin. It's really, really important to remember that all of that's done at the origin. Now we want to create our mesh network of it. Actually, before I do that, let's just add a directional light and have it point downward. And with that directional light, just adds a little bit of flavor. We can have ray trace shadows, and then press number 7, and we can even create a polygon plane for that object to hit, and we can turn on lighting shadows to see the shadow, and then go to our create light, ambient light, just like we did last time, and set the ambient light to something like 0.25, and that just gives us a little bit more interest. You can take those 2 lights and even group them and move them below the ground plane where they're positionally doesn't really matter. So that gives us something a little bit more visually interesting to look at. All right, and those are my lights. Okay, so this cube, there we go, and then go to the create mesh network and double click the distribution node, or not double click it, click the distribution node and choose grid. And let's set this to something simple like 10 by 10, 10 by 10. Something like that. And we want, this is a little different than what's in his video because they've consolidated and changed the nodes a little bit. What we want is the offset node. And we want to disable, we want to disable scale. And I'm going to change their position. Let's start with just position. We're going to change their position by a value of 1 as a fall off node travels across it. So we're going to get our fall off node, and that's going to be right clicking in there and choosing connect. And I'll change the scale of it a bit and double click it. And I wanted to point out something I didn't say earlier. If we change this to add, the inner zone is like how strong the inside of it is. And that's something really important to pay attention to. So let's set the inner zone to 0.5. And then we can move the object across it, which we can see has the effect on the filter. We can then change add fade to something like 0.025. So now as we travel across it, it lifts and it drops. Okay, and then what I want to do is change the fall off position and set this to spline and set this to spline, and this one to spline, and this one to spline. And now as I travel across, we can see it has like a zone in which it impacts it. Very cool. We can increase that as we travel across diagonally. We can even keyframe that position a little bit later. Then I want to manipulate its rotation. And I could do this as a separate node, or I could attempt to do it in the same node. I want to rotate it upside down. So I want to do 180 degrees on the x-axis. So as I travel across, we can see them flipping. Like so. And I think what I want to do is run the rotation on its own offset node. And that way I can set that offset node to not have the add fade. So if they disable rotation on this one, and I add offset on, say, this one, and then again disable position and scale, but rotate on X 180, and set the fall off object to create, and this time it's add. Inner zone could be the same, and add fade, we don't want it to add fade, we simply want it to add. So as it travels across, it changes its rotation. Right, and then I want this second offset node to have, add. I do want add mode fade. I forgot about that. We can keep that at the same, 0.025. But its position is what's uniquely different. So here, as I travel across, they'll rotate and then return back to their shape as I travel across. And then to get these things to work together, I'll make this one a child of that one, and I will set its transformation to be 0, 0, 0, the child to be 0, 0, 0. So all of my animated effect is now done on a single object, and now I can travel across in this cool wave. Like so. It's just pretty cool. And then we can play with it from there. We could say change the what happens if you change the Z rotation, and what we get is this bi-directional rotation, which is, I think, pretty wild. And then if we want to increase the range of the translation of the position, we can increase that here, and we can increase that with the inner zone. You see, so if we decrease inner zone, increase inner zone, we're changing the range of how that rotates. So we could decrease the inner zone, expanding that. We can even change the position of where that inner zone changes, giving us a unique change to our effect. So that way we don't all have the same thing. That's a lot of fun. And that's that part. So now what I'm going to do is keyframe. I'm going to keyframe across this. So I'll take this object and key it across. So I'll press S to key it. And let's go with 1 second. And we'll come across like this and key it. And then we can even go to the graph editor and edit. We really don't need any rotation or scale, we can take those keys and delete them so we just have translation. We can set that to linear, so that's nice and straight. So we rewind and hit play, it'll come across like so. That's probably a bit too fast. Let's change the speed on that. So I'll shift click and drag, and then click and drag. Let's stretch that out to about maybe 70 or so frames and see how that feels. That feels better. We can always come back and edit that particular timing later. So if you get a timing that's close, we're good. And maybe a little longer, maybe 96, a 4-second change. So let's set these keys to 96. I think that might look nice. That's not bad. All right. We can tweak this and adjust it as we go. Now, what I want to do is take the repro mesh. You notice I said earlier that the network creates one mesh, right? Well, now we can build a mesh. Now we can build a mesh network on with this mesh, right? So if we take this repro, and we might as well save before we do anything so we don't lose all of that good work, just in case, just in case things go sour. This is going to be mesh number 2. Good. Okay, now what we're going to do is, create a new network from this mesh. So create mesh network. So we've got the original, and we've got this new one, and we can rename this one cube. Okay, so this is going to be the cube part. Now I'll create a new polygon cube. Make it big. Actually, don't scale it. Let's do it this way. With height, let's make it 10 by 10 by 10. Make it bigger than that. 20 by 20 by 20. So how big is our floor? Do you guys remember? What is it? It's 10 by 10 by 10. Okay, yeah. So 10 by 10 by 10 would be sufficient. Let's stay on easy numbers. Good. Then we'll just reposition it. Rotate it to some arbitrary rotation, whatever that might be. And this new cube is going to have a mesh as an input. That mesh is going to be the big, this is the spinning cube, and we're going to group it, Control G, spin, and it's the spin that's going to be done on the group, so it's going to spin on the y-axis. So if I hold Control and I right-click and drag, I can animate the spin of this cube. Okay, then here we got mesh set, we got method. Method's going to be per face, center, and then the spinning cube is the input mesh. Isn't that awesome? Let's set the size of this cube to be 11 by 11 by 11. And now everything fits nice and tight. So when we play, there's that. Really cool. Now we can go back to Ian Waters' video and investigate more specifically some of the things that he did for that video, for that particular effect. But this is the framework for that effect, and then from there we can tweak it and modify it and adjust it from there. I think it's worth looking into a little bit further. Definitely keyframing the rotation. Something comes along, maybe like at frame 10, we start to rotate, and then maybe here we set another key and we start to rotate that thing. Let's set that to something like maybe 25 degrees. It's pretty wild. And then come back in and change the timing of this guy. Maybe not that slow. Maybe a little quicker. Maybe just a little bit quicker. Okay, and then just to sweeten the deal a little bit, we're going to add a dynamic at the end. We're going to add a spring. And the spring is going to give us a nice bounce. And we can tweak the spring to be a little bit more. Can we go over we can't go over 1, but we could reduce its dampening. And we can see a bit of a dance as they settle. And that's your follow through. And we could reduce the stiffness. We could even increase dampening variation. We could be at this a while, tweaking it and adjusting it. So I hope you have fun with this one. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll continue down this list in the next lecture. I do anticipate this will be about 4 lectures. All right, see you soon.